The morning at Galactic Academy Station Nexus 7 began, just like every other Tuesday. Students from across the galaxy shuffled into Laboratory 7, carrying their data tablets and complaining about the early hour. The massive space station hummed, with its usual background noise of life, support systems, and distant conversations in dozens of alien languages. Jake Thompson slumped into his usual seat in the back corner, still nursing a cup of what humans called coffee, but most aliens found toxic. At 19, he was the only human enrolled in advanced xenobiology, a fact that made him both curious and slightly uncomfortable to his classmates. Most days, he tried to blend in and avoid drawing attention to his species' reputation. Professor Veldon, a tall blue creature with flowing tentacles for arms, was halfway through explaining how Altarian crystal beings processed nutrients when everything changed in an instant. The lights shifted from their normal warm white to a harsh, pulsing red. The change was so sudden that several students looked up from their tablets in confusion. Then came the sound that made everyone's blood run cold, the emergency clap. The piercing wail cut through the classroom like a knife, growing louder and more urgent with each passing second. Heavy blast doors slammed down over every exit with a thunderous crash that shook the floor. The reinforced metal barriers, designed to contain everything from chemical explosions to hostile aliens, trapped all 23 students inside. The sudden silence after the door sealed was almost worse than the alarms. "What's happening?" squeaked Thyra, a small furry creature, whose species was known for their nervous dispositions. Her whiskers twitched frantically as she looked around the room. Professor Veldon moved toward the main control panel, his tentacles dancing over the emergency communication system. "I'm trying to reach security," he said, but his voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there moments before. That's when they saw it through the reinforced viewing window that looked out into the main corridor. The creature moved like liquid death, flowing down the hallway with movements too smooth and precise to be natural. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, with a sleek black exoskeleton that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 6 limbs ending in razor-sharp claws clicked softly against the metal floor as it walked. Its head turned from side to side with mechanical precision, scanning for something. "Veltar," Professor Veldon whispered, and the word hit the room like a physical blow. Every alien student in the classroom knew that name. Veltar assassins were legends of terror across the galaxy. They were bred and trained from birth to be perfect killing machines. No one survived an encounter with a Veltar. No one even tried to fight them. When a Veltar came for you, you simply died. The reaction was immediate and devastating. The crystalline Shamori students, beings made of living glass, began to crack under the stress. Hairline fractures appeared across their translucent bodies as their fear manifested physically. The sound of their breaking was like wind chimes in a hurricane. The ethereal students, creatures of living gas, held together by will alone, started to lose cohesion. Parts of their cloudy forms began to drift apart as panic overwhelmed their ability to maintain shape. One of them dispersed so badly that classmates had to help gather his consciousness back together. Kapfa, a reptilian student with emerald scales, pressed himself against the far wall. His natural camouflage abilities kicked in, causing his scales to shift colors rapidly as his body tried to hide him from the predator outside. Other students simply collapsed, overwhelmed by terror. But in the back corner of the room, Jake Thompson sat perfectly still. While chaos erupted around him, the human student remained motionless in his chair. His brown eyes tracked the assassin's movement through the window with the same casual interest he might show watching birds outside his bedroom back on Earth. There was no fear on his face, no panic in his posture. "Why isn't the Deathworlder running?" Kethfa whispered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of his classmates' terror. The question hung in the air like smoke. Every other species represented in that classroom was reacting exactly as evolution had programmed them when faced with a superior predator: flee, hide, or freeze in terror. but the human just sat there, watching. Jake didn't respond to the question. His mind was working, but not in the way his classmates expected. He wasn't frozen with shock or paralyzed by fear. Instead, he was counting. Counting the assassin's steps, timing how long it took to move from one end of the corridor to the other, noting which direction it favored when turning its head. His eyes swept the laboratory, cataloging every piece of equipment, every chemical container, every potential tool or weapon. The plasma cutters used for precision work on crystal samples. The gravity manipulation devices for handling dangerous materials. The emergency systems built into every wall. To his terrified classmates, Jake's stillness looked like the shock response of prey facing a predator. They had no idea that his mind was working with the cold, calculating efficiency of something far more dangerous than what stalked the corridor outside. The sound began as a soft hiss, barely audible over the whimpering of frightened students. Then it grew louder, more insistent. Something was cutting through the reinforced laboratory door, the metal beginning to glow orange as superheated tools carved through it like butter. The Veltar had found them. The melted metal of the laboratory door still glowed red hot as the Veltar assassin stepped through the opening. The creature moved with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large and deadly, each of its 6 limbs placed precisely, never making an unnecessary sound. Its exoskeleton gleamed like polished obsidian, and those razor-sharp claws caught the emergency lighting as they flexed with anticipation. Standing at its full height of 8 feet, the assassin filled the doorway completely. Its head swiveled slowly from left to right, taking in every detail of the classroom with cold, calculating eyes. This was a perfect killing machine, bred and trained for one purpose, eliminating targets with ruthless efficiency. Every species in the known galaxy had the same reaction when facing a Veltar assassin. Some would scream in terror. Others would drop to their knees and beg for mercy, though mercy was not a concept these creatures understood. The lucky ones would simply faint, sparing themselves the conscious experience of their final moments. The assassin paused in the doorway, waiting for the familiar sounds of panic that always accompanied its arrival. It expected crying, pleading, the desperate scramble of prey trying to find hiding places that didn't exist. Instead, it got something it had never encountered before: complete silence. The classroom was eerily quiet. Even the Shamori students had stopped their crystalline crackling, too terrified to make any sound. The ethereal beings had managed to pull themselves back together, just enough to avoid complete dispersal. Everyone held their breath, afraid that the slightest noise might draw the killer's attention. But then something happened that defied every piece of data in the Veltar's extensive combat database. Jake Thompson stood up from his seat in the back. Rowan walked calmly to the front of the classroom, not running away from the assassin, but moving toward it. His movements were slow and deliberate, like someone taking a casual stroll through a park rather than facing certain death. In the few seconds it had taken the Veltar to cut through the door, Jake had somehow managed to grab a plasma torch from the welding station and modify it. The device hummed with energy in his hands, though how he'd managed to reconfigure laboratory equipment so quickly was beyond the understanding of his watching classmates. "Everyone stay behind the lab benches," Jake said in a voice so calm, it seemed almost absurd given the circumstances. He might have been giving directions to a museum tour rather than facing down a legendary killer. His eyes never left the Veltar, tracking its every movement with unwavering focus. The assassin's head tilted slightly to one side, an expression of confusion crossing its alien features. This wasn't how prey was supposed to behave. The mammal should have been running, screaming, or already dead. Instead, it was standing between the killer and its other potential victims, holding some kind of improvised weapon. "Move slowly toward the emergency exit when I give this signal," Jake continued, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made his classmates want to obey without question. Even in their terror, they found themselves responding to his calm leadership. Professor Veldon pressed himself against the back wall, his tentacles trembling with fear and confusion. In all his years of teaching, he had never seen anything like this. The human student, who usually sat quietly in the back, asking thoughtful questions about alien biology, had transformed into something entirely different. The Veltar took a step forward, its claws clicking against the metal floor. The sound made several students whimper, but Jake didn't even flinch. Instead, he began moving sideways, away from his classmates and along the front of the laboratory to most of the alien observers. It looked like Jake was backing down, retreating from the superior predator. They watched in growing despair as their unlikely protectors seemed to be abandoning them to the killer's mercy. But Lily Harrison, a graduate student who had spent the last semester studying human evolutionary history, recognized something that the others missed. She had written her thesis on persistence hunting patterns in early human societies. The way Jake was moving, the careful positioning, the lateral steps that kept him between the predator and the group, while gradually leading it away from them. This wasn't retreat. He's not running away, she whispered to herself, barely breathing the words. He's setting up a hunt. The Veltar followed Jake's movement with predatory interest, its head tracking him like a weapon system locking onto a target. The creature was programmed to eliminate threats in order of priority, and the human holding the modified plasma torch clearly ranked highest on that list. Jake continued his sideways movement, never turning his back on the assassin but gradually drawing its attention further from his classmates. His breathing remained steady, his grip on the improvised weapon firm but relaxed. Every step seemed calculated, purposeful. The other students watched in fascination and growing hope as their quiet classmate transformed before their eyes. The shy human who struggled with public speaking and always ate lunch alone had become something else entirely, a protector, a hunter, a force of nature that stood between them and certain death. The Veltar assassin, for the first time in its existence, found itself dealing with prey that refused to act like prey. This soft, seemingly defenseless creature was challenging it, drawing it into what appeared to be some kind of tactical engagement, rather than simply dying as nature intended. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Two predators, separated by millions of years of evolution and countless light years of space, sizing each other up across a laboratory classroom. Then Jake took another step sideways, and the real hunt began. The Veltar assassin had been bred and trained for one type of combat: swift, overwhelming strikes that ended conflicts in seconds. What it faced now was something entirely outside its programming and experience. Jake Thompson wasn't trying to overpower it or outrun it. Instead, he was doing something that seemed almost impossible. He was hunting the hunter. Deep in Jake's genetic memory lay millions of years of evolutionary programming. His ancestors hadn't been the fastest creatures on the African plains, nor the strongest. They couldn't climb like apes or fight like big cats. But they had one advantage that had carried them to the top of the food chain: they never gave up. When early humans wanted to bring down a gazelle, or even a mammoth, they didn't rely on a single explosive attack. They wore their prey down, following it for hours or even days, until exhaustion made the kill inevitable. Jake began to move through the laboratory with purpose, and the Veltar followed. What looked random to the terrified students was actually a carefully planned route. Jake used his modified plasma torch to melt strategic metal supports, causing heavy equipment to shift and block certain pathways. When the assassin tried to take a shortcut between lab benches, it found its route blocked by a toppled spectrometer. "Stay low and keep moving toward the back," Jake called to his classmates without taking his eyes off his pursuer. His voice remained steady, though he was now breathing slightly harder from the constant movement. The chase led through the main laboratory space, around massive equipment designed for studying alien minerals and biological samples. Jake knew every inch of this room from months of attending classes here. He knew which floor panels were loose, which equipment could be safely moved, and most importantly, where every emergency control was located. As the Veltar lunged forward with those deadly claws extended, Jake rolled under a lab table and triggered an emergency gravity field generator. The device, normally used to create Earth-like gravity for human comfort, suddenly reversed its polarity. The assassin found itself slammed upward into the ceiling with bone-crushing force before the field cut out and dropped it back to the floor. But the creature recovered quickly, its exoskeleton absorbing most of the impact. It spun around, looking for its elusive target, only to discover that Jake had moved again. Now the human was across the room, calmly pouring something from a chemical storage container across the floor. The liquid hissed and bubbled where it landed, creating a barrier of corrosive foam that would burn through the Veltar's footpads, but barely affect Jake's rubber-soled shoes. How was he doing this? Gasped Thyra, the small furry student who had pressed herself behind an overturned desk. Her species was known for their quick reflexes, but even she couldn't follow Jake's movements as he seemed to anticipate the assassin's every move. Professor Veldon watched in growing amazement as his quiet human student systematically turned the familiar classroom into a death trap for one of the galaxy's most feared killers. He's using persistence hunting tactics, the professor whispered to no one in particular, but against a Veltar, that should be impossible. The concept was alien to most galactic species. When they fought, it was usually brief and decisive. Strength against strength, speed against speed. The idea of wearing down an opponent through endurance and tactical thinking was foreign to creatures who had evolved in different environments with different survival pressures. Jake triggered another emergency system, this time activating the laboratory's containment fields. Invisible barriers of energy suddenly blocked several routes, forcing the Veltar into an increasingly narrow path of movement. The assassin found itself being herded like livestock, guided through a maze that Jake was creating in real time. The creature tried to adapt, using its superior speed to rush Jake directly, but the human had already anticipated this move. As the Veltar charged, Jake activated a magnetic field generator normally used for handling metallic samples. The assassin's metal claws and exoskeleton components were suddenly pulled sideways, throwing off its balance and sending it crashing into a wall of specimen containers. Chemical samples scattered everywhere, mixing on the floor to create clouds of harmless but obscuring gas. The Veltar's enhanced vision systems, designed to work in perfect conditions, struggled with the sudden atmospheric changes. Meanwhile, Jake moved through the chemical fog like it wasn't even there. His human eyes evolved to work in everything from bright sunlight to near darkness, adapted quickly. His sense of smell, often overlooked compared to his alien classmates' more specialized senses, helped him navigate by detecting the different chemical signatures throughout the room. 20 minutes into what should have been a 30-second kill, the Veltar assassin experienced something completely foreign to its species: fatigue. Its movements became slightly less precise, its reactions slowed by fractions of a second. The creature had been designed for short bursts of overwhelming violence, not extended combat. Jake, on the other hand, was just hitting his stride. His breathing had settled into a steady rhythm. His movements remained fluid and controlled. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but his endurance was built for exactly this kind of prolonged effort. His ancestors had run down prey across continents. A single laboratory was nothing compared to that evolutionary legacy. The other students watched in silent awe as their human classmate demonstrated why Earth was classified as a death world. It wasn't just the dangerous environment that made humans formidable, it was what that environment had created. A species that refused to quit, that turned every disadvantage into a weapon, and that never stopped hunting once they had chosen their target. The Veltar was beginning to understand that it had made a terrible mistake. It hadn't cornered helpless prey in this laboratory. It had trapped itself in a cage with something far more dangerous than it had ever imagined. 20 minutes had passed since the Veltar assassin first entered the laboratory, and everything had changed. The creature that had glided through the doorway with deadly confidence was now moving slower. Its breathing labored and irregular. Dark fluid leaked from several cracks in its once pristine exoskeleton. Its 6 limbs, which had moved with mechanical precision, now trembled slightly with exhaustion. Jake, meanwhile, looked like he was just getting warmed up. His shirt was damp with sweat, but his breathing remained controlled and steady. His eyes still tracked every movement of his opponent with laser focus. This was exactly the kind of extended physical challenge that human physiology had been designed for over millions of years of evolution. During his months of studying xenobiology, Jake had memorized the respiratory systems of dozens of alien species. The Veltar breathed through specialized filters in their exoskeleton that were incredibly efficient at processing their homeworld's atmosphere. But those same filters became a liability when exposed to certain chemical compounds found in standard Earth atmosphere laboratories. The various solutions Jake had been spreading around the room weren't just creating obstacles, they were slowly poisoning his opponent. The creature's breathing had become increasingly desperate as its filtration system struggled to process the foreign chemicals. What would be harmless to humans was gradually suffocating the assassin. But Jake wasn't the type to sit back and wait for victory to come to him. His mind raced through everything he'd learned in his engineering classes back on Earth. Combined with months of working with advanced alien technology in the laboratory, the plasma torch in his hands was no longer just a cutting tool. Jake had somehow rewired it to pulse in controlled bursts, turning it into a projectile weapon. He fired superheated plasma blasts at strategic points around the room, not trying to hit the Veltar directly, but instead creating a network of molten metal barriers that further controlled the creature's movement. From the chemical storage area, Jake grabbed several containers of cleaning solutions. To any observer, they looked harmless, just basic maintenance supplies for keeping laboratory equipment clean. But Jake mixed them in precise ratios, creating compounds that reacted violently when they came into contact with the metallic components of the Veltar's exoskeleton. The assassin tried to charge through one of Jake's chemical barriers, and immediately regretted it. The solution ate away at its footpads, causing the creature to stumble and crash into a wall of expensive monitoring equipment. Jake had also discovered something interesting about the laboratory's magnetic field generators. These devices were designed to contain and manipulate metallic samples during experiments, but with a few quick adjustments to their power settings and field geometry, they became something else entirely, weapons that could grab the Veltar's metal components and throw the creature around like a toy. The assassin found itself yanked sideways by invisible forces, slammed into walls, and spun around helplessly as Jake manipulated the magnetic fields from across the room. Each impact cracked the creature's exoskeleton a little more, and dark alien blood began to pool on the laboratory floor. In the security control room, 3 levels above, Dr. Rebecca Stone watched the impossible scene unfold on multiple monitor screens. She had studied human behavioral patterns for years, but nothing in her research had prepared her for this. "He's not just defending himself," she whispered to the empty room. "He's systematically dismantling one of the most dangerous predators in known space." The other Academy staff members who had gathered to watch the security feeds stood in stunned silence. They were witnessing something that would be talked about in xenobiology classes for decades to come. A human demonstrating why their species was both feared and respected throughout the galaxy. Jake had turned the familiar classroom into a battlefield where every piece of equipment became a weapon. Gravity generators became catapults. Chemical storage became an armory. Emergency systems became trap mechanisms. The quiet student who usually asked thoughtful questions about alien reproduction cycles was revealing the terrifying adaptability that had carried humanity from cave dwellers to star travelers. The Veltar assassin, wounded and desperate, made one final attempt to end the fight. It gathered its remaining strength and launched itself directly at Jake with all 6 claws extended, putting everything into one last killing strike. Jake stood perfectly still, holding what looked like a modified emergency beacon, a device designed to send distress signals to rescue ships. But like everything else Jake had touched that day, it had been transformed into something entirely different. As the Veltar flew through the air toward him, Jake calmly pressed a button on the device. The electromagnetic pulse that erupted from the beacon was invisible, but its effects were immediate and devastating. The Veltar's cybernetic enhancements, the computer-assisted reflexes, the tactical analysis systems, the enhanced coordination between its organic brain and mechanical components, all shut down instantly. The creature crashed to the floor in a twitching heap, its body unable to coordinate basic movements without its electronic assistance. It was like watching a sophisticated computer suddenly lose power, leaving only confused biological instincts behind. Jake walked over to the physics equipment storage and retrieved a set of magnetic restraints normally used for securing dangerous materials during transport. He calmly applied them to the Veltar's limbs, making sure the creature was completely immobilized. Before stepping back to survey his work, the legendary assassin that had entered the room as an unstoppable killing machine was now just another laboratory specimen, secured and harmless. Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked around at his stunned classmates. "Someone want to call security?" he asked, his tone as casual as if he were asking someone to pass him a pencil. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Professor Veldon's tentacles sliding down the wall as the alien educator slowly collapsed in shock. The laboratory fell into a strange kind of silence that felt heavier than the chaos that had just ended. Emergency lights still bathed everything in red, casting long shadows across the room, filled with improvised weapons and chemical spills. The Veltar assassin lay motionless on the floor, secured by magnetic restraints, its deadly reputation reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. 20 pairs of alien eyes stared at Jake Thompson with expressions ranging from awe to terror to complete bewilderment. These were the same classmates who had shared lunch tables with him, borrowed notes from him when they missed lectures, and complained with him about Professor Veldon's impossible exam questions. The quiet human who always sat in the back row, who apologized when he accidentally bumped into someone, who helped carry equipment without being asked. That gentle student had just systematically dismantled one of the most feared predators in known space, using nothing but classroom supplies and his own ingenuity. "Are you all okay?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the same gentle concern it always had when someone struggled with a difficult concept in class. He walked over to where Krista, one of the Shimori students, sat against the wall. Her translucent body showed spider cracks from the stress of the attack, the crystalline structure that made up her being damaged by the sheer terror she had experienced. Jake knelt down beside her, his hands steady and careful as he examined the fractures. These were the same hands that had just jury-rigged plasma weapons and mixed chemical compounds into deadly barriers. Now they moved with delicate precision, helping Krista realign her crystal matrix so her natural healing could begin. "The stress fractures aren't too deep," Jake said softly, his knowledge of alien physiology coming in handy once again. "You should be fine in a few hours. Just try to stay calm and let your body regenerate." The contrast was staggering. His classmates watched him move from student to student, checking for injuries and offering comfort, while behind him lay the evidence of tactical brilliance that had turned their familiar classroom into a battlefield where he had emerged victorious. "Professor," Veldon finally found his voice, though his tentacles continued to shake as he approached Jake slowly. The professor had taught xenobiology for over 30 standard years, had written papers on predator-prey relationships across dozens of worlds, but nothing in his academic experience had prepared him for what he had just witnessed. "Jake," the professor said, his voice barely above a whisper, "how did you know what to do? How could you possibly have been prepared for something like this?" Jake looked up from where he was helping another student, his expression genuinely puzzled by the question. He tilted his head slightly, the way he did in class when someone asked something he thought had an obvious answer. "It was just problem solving, wasn't it?" Jake said with a slight shrug. "I mean, there was a threat in the room. I looked at what resources were available. I figured out the most efficient way to neutralize the danger while protecting everyone else." He paused, noticing the stunned expressions on every face around him. That's normal, right? That's what anyone would do." The silence that followed was profound. Normal. What Jake had just done was anything but normal by galactic standards. Most species, when faced with a Veltor assassin, would either freeze in terror, attempt to flee, or at best try to hide and hope they weren't found. The idea of turning the encounter into a tactical engagement and actually winning was beyond the comprehension of most civilized species. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridors outside the laboratory. Heavy boots and the electronic beeping of security equipment grew louder as the Academy's response team finally reached the scene. The blast doors that had trapped them all inside began to cycle open with a pneumatic hiss. David Martinez, the Academy's human counselor, was the first through the door. He took one look at the scene, the restrained Veltar assassin, the jury-rigged weapons scattered around the room, the chemical burns on the floor, and Jake sitting calmly beside an injured student, and let out a long, weary sigh. "Well," David said, pulling out his data tablet and making notes, "I suppose this means we'll need to update the orientation materials again. Add a section about human crisis response protocols and what to expect if your human classmate feels threatened." Behind him, the security team spread out to secure the scene. Several of the guards were human themselves, and Jake could see the recognition in their eyes. They understood what had happened here in a way that the alien staff couldn't quite grasp. As the unconscious assassin was loaded onto a medical transport stretcher, Jake calmly walked back to his seat in the back row. He pulled out his homework assignment, a paper on respiratory adaptations in oxygen environments that was due tomorrow, and began reviewing his notes as if nothing unusual had happened. Around him, his classmates continued to stare and whisper, in dozens of different languages. He caught fragments of conversation, all variations on the same theme. "Did you see what the human did? How was something like that even possible? I thought humans were supposed to be peaceful." The whispers would continue long after class ended. They would spread through the dormitories, the cafeterias, the recreational areas. Students would call home to distant planets, trying to explain to their families what they had witnessed. The story would grow in the telling, becoming legend within hours. Urgent communications were flashing across the galactic network. Academy, administrators, government officials, and military leaders all received the same basic message. The behavioral classification files on humans needed immediate revision. The species that had been listed as dangerous but manageable was being upgraded to a new category entirely. The official designation would read Protective Apex Predators. Do not threaten their social groups. Additional notes warned that humans under stress displayed tactical intelligence, improvisation abilities, and persistence that far exceeded previous estimates. But in Laboratory 7, Jake Thompson just wanted to finish his homework and maybe grab dinner before the cafeteria closed. He had no idea that he had just changed how the galaxy viewed his entire species. He was just glad everyone was safe.